Sir, this seat is reserved for distinguished guests. The general audience is in the back. That's what the young officer told him. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, just nodded once, and quietly moved to the last row. It was the 50th anniversary of Clearwater Naval Academy, a place built on legacy, precision, and military honor. The courtyard was filled with medals, photographers, and admirals in full dress. No one paid much attention to the old man in the wrinkled shirt. No one asked why his name was on the VIP list, or why his hands never stopped clutching a paper bag. Not until the Headmaster, a retired four-star admiral, stopped mid-speech and asked the crowd, "Is Sergeant Jonathan Reed here today?" Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning air was crisp as sunlight spilled over the stone walls of Clearwater Naval Academy. Flags fluttered along the walkway, perfectly timed with the breeze. On the central lawn, white chairs had been arranged in rows with military precision, each one marked for a guest, a title, a purpose. Every corner of the courtyard had been checked, polished, approved. It was, after all, the 50th anniversary of one of the nation's most respected military academies. Cadets in spotless dress whites stood at attention. Retired admirals greeted old friends with quiet nods. A brass quartet rehearsed near the west steps. Camera crews adjusted their tripods. Across the front row, names had been carefully printed and laminated, each corresponding to a war hero, a dignitary, or a donor whose name adorned a building on campus. There was a hum in the air, the kind that comes just before something important begins. And then, from the far edge of the courtyard, a figure appeared, moving slowly, but with deliberate steps. He wasn't wearing a uniform, no medals pinned to his chest, no hat tucked under his arm, just a plain white dress shirt, sleeves buttoned, collar pressed. Over it, a light tan jacket, the kind worn in fall by men who no longer needed to impress anyone. His khakis were clean, if a little worn at the cuffs, his shoes leather. Ox blood shined like mirrors. Despite their age, he was alone. No family, no assistant, no cameras following his steps. In one hand, he carried a folded-up program he'd printed himself at the local library. In the other, a soft canvas pouch frayed at the edges. It swayed gently as he walked past younger guests arriving in town cars and dress blues. His name was Jonathan M. Reed, 85 years old. Born in Nebraska, retired U.S. Marine Corps. He'd taken the 6:00 a.m. bus from Cedar Falls, Iowa. The kind of bus that still stops at diners with cracked formica tables and offers free coffee refills if you wait long enough. He'd left his home at dawn with one mission: to attend the Academy's 50th anniversary. Not to be seen, not to be celebrated, just to be there. As he neared the front, a young staff member glanced up from a clipboard. "Good morning, sir. Last name Reed," the man said, his voice calm, worn, but steady. The staffer flipped a few pages, nodded, and smiled. "Ah, yes, Jonathan Reed. You're in the front section. Right this way." Jonathan thanked him with a slight tip of the head and began walking toward the reserved seats near the podium. But then something subtle happened. From the left, a cluster of junior officers, 3 men and a woman, all under 30, turned toward him as he approached. They were mid-conversation, laughing about something that had happened at officer candidate school. One of them, a young lieutenant with a buzz cut and sharp blue eyes, stood up when he saw Jonathan aiming for the row ahead. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "Polite, measured. These seats are actually reserved for distinguished guests. The general public is over that way." Jonathan paused. He looked down at the printed program in his hand. His name was clearly marked on the list, row 1 through seat 3, but he didn't raise it, didn't explain, didn't argue. He looked up at the officer and nodded once. "No problem," he said quietly, and without another word, he turned, walked several steps back, and found an empty seat near the rear edge of the courtyard. No one noticed the slight tremble in his hands as he sat down. No one paid attention to the faded Marine Corps pin near his collar. They saw an old man, out of place, wearing the wrong jacket, in the wrong row. The moment passed quickly. The lieutenant returned to his seat, tapping something on his phone. The brass band began tuning again. Ushers continued ushering. The press snapped more photos of officials shaking hands in front of the academy's fountain. From the back row, Jonathan sat silently, folding his program twice over. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't surprised. This wasn't the first time he'd been overlooked. In fact, that's exactly how he had lived the last 50 years quietly, intentionally. He had never chased titles, never gave interviews. Most of his neighbors didn't even know he had served, and certainly none of these young officers had reason to recognize him. As he sat there, the wind shifted slightly, and the pouch in his hand rustled. Inside was a yellowed letter dated July 3rd, 1974, written in typewriter font, signed by a young commander named Carl A. Whitaker. At the time, Whitaker was a junior officer struggling to save the fledgling Clearwater Academy from budget cuts and low enrollment. Jonathan Reed, a Marine newly returned from overseas, had volunteered on his own time, without pay, to help design the Academy's first ground tactics course. He'd trained cadets in the mud, rebuilt an old barn into a training shelter, wrote the field manual by hand, ate alone in the mess hall, slept in the barracks to keep watch. He never asked for credit. That letter, he'd only kept it because it reminded him what mattered. Now, nearly 5 decades later, he was back, not to receive thanks, but simply to witness what had become of a place he once helped build with his bare hands. He looked out across the sea of white chairs, gleaming brass buttons, and polished shoes. Then he looked down at his own. Same polish, same shine, different eyes noticing. Jonathan leaned back slightly and let the sounds of the courtyard swell around him. Music, laughter, instructions on headsets. And slowly, he closed his eyes for a moment, just to listen, just to be. Up front, someone tested the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin the ceremony in 5 minutes. Please take your seats." He heard it, but didn't move, because in his heart, he had already found his place. It didn't have to be in the front row. It only had to be within reach of memory. From his seat near the back, Jonathan Reed sat quietly. The sunlight had shifted. What had once been cool and golden was now warmer, spilling across the rows of officers and dignitaries with the soft rhythm of a late morning breeze. Voices lowered as a hush swept over the courtyard. A few guests adjusted their medals. The color guard stood ready at attention. And at the very center of it all, the stage waited draped in navy blue, flanked by towering banners that marked 50 years of Clearwater's proud history. But none of that noise reached Jonathan. His world, for now, stayed inside the small paper bag he rested gently on his lap. From the outside, it looked like nothing. Just a plain brown sack, creased at the edges. But inside were 3 things he hadn't opened in a long time. A cracked Marine Corps insignia pin, its silver edges dulled by decades of sun and grit. A worn green field notebook, soft at the corners, the kind used to log patrols in places that no longer appeared on maps. And a letter, folded twice, the paper now yellowed and delicate, bearing the typed signature of a young officer named Carl Whitaker. He didn't reach for them yet, just let the weight of the bag settle across his knees. Some things, after all, don't need to be touched to be remembered. A soft voice interrupted the stillness beside him. "Sir." It was a cadet, maybe 22, 23, tall, buzzed blonde hair under his cover. His uniform was crisp, the insignia sharp. He looked like he belonged on the front of a recruiting poster. Jonathan turned slowly. The boy's eyes were respectful, but curious. I saw your pin," the cadet said. "Are you Marine Corps?" Jonathan gave a small nod. "Retired, long time ago." The cadet hesitated. "My father's a gunnery sergeant, Iraq, 2004. I grew up with stories, about the old Corps. You served in the Pacific." Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle, just enough for the boy to catch it. "Not quite that far back," he said. "Vietnam. 69, Hugh. Mostly. Spent some time near Quang Tri, The cadet's expression shifted half respect, half surprise. That's intense. Were you with 1st Marine Division, 3rd Battalion? 5th Marines, Jonathan replied. Charlie Company. The cadet leaned forward slightly. Sir, were you part of the founding staff here at the academy? I mean, Jonathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the brown bag and took out the field notebook. He turned it over in his hands once, then offered it to the cadet. Page 3, he said. The cadet opened it carefully, his brow furrowed. The ink was faded, but the heading was still legible. Introductory Amphibious Assault Concepts, Clearwater Curriculum Draft, Fall 1974. Below it, diagrams, notes, and a rough training schedule in longhand. At the bottom, in red ink, signed and logged, Sergeant J.M. Reed. You wrote this, the cadet asked. Stunned. Jonathan nodded slowly. Wasn't supposed to. But we didn't have much back then. No budget, no structure. We taught from experience, built what we could. The cadet's voice lowered. Sir, this is like academy history. Jonathan offered a small smile. Funny thing about history. Nobody notices when you're making it. You just do the work. Hope someone down the line does it better. There was a pause. Then the cadet leaned closer. Is it true what they say about General Whitaker? Jonathan turned his eyes back to the stage. You mean did I pull him out of a blown-up Jeep in the Philippines? Yeah, that happened. The cadet's jaw tightened. And no one here knows. Jonathan shook his head. Most wouldn't believe it anyway. But why didn't you ever tell anyone? The old Marine smiled again. Not bitter, not proud, just still, because it was never about me. He reached back into the bag and took out the letter. His fingers lingered over the crease before unfolding it. Then he passed it to the cadet, letting him read the typed words aloud in a near whisper. To Sergeant Reed, this academy would not have survived its first year without your guidance. You gave us more than tactics. You gave us standards. Someday, I hope I can repay that debt. Respectfully, Lottie, Carl A. Whitaker, Clearwater Naval Academy, Ochoanar, 1974. The cadet looked up. His voice had softened. He's the headmaster now. Jonathan nodded. I know, and he invited you. Jonathan tapped the folded program on his lap. Got the call myself. He wanted me to sit beside him today, but I didn't wear the right jacket, and I didn't want to correct anyone. The cadet glanced toward the front. That lieutenant he didn't know. If he had Jonathan held up a hand, cutting the thought short, it's all right. He's not the story. There was a pause. Wind rustled the banners above. What is? Then the cadet finally asked. Jonathan looked out over the courtyard. His voice was lower now. That we're still here. That this place still trains men and women who serve with honor. That somewhere in those seats is the next instructor who'll give more than he's asked, and ask for nothing in return. The cadet swallowed, quietly folding the notebook and handing it back. You should be on that stage, sir. Jonathan took the notebook gently, tucked it back into the pouch, and smiled. I was once, just not the way most people expect. The boy stood, his posture now straighter, more conscious of his bearing. Would you mind if I stayed here a while? Jonathan looked at him, then nodded once. Be my guest. Together. They sat in silence. Who around them? The final preparations for the ceremony moved forward. The brass section adjusted their music sheets. A white-gloved officer passed out speaking notes. The sun now hung high above the stage, glinting off epaulets and polished brass buttons. But in the shade of the back row, two generations shared a moment that didn't need to be broadcast. Because legacy doesn't always come with microphones. Sometimes it just passes quietly from one hand to another. The bell tower struck 11. One clear, deep tone echoed through the courtyard, and just like that, the crowd stood in unison. Officers adjusted their hats. Cadets came to attention. The choir, dressed in navy blazers, began the national anthem. Jonathan Reed, seated at the very back, rose with the others. He held his hand just above his heart, not in salute, not in pride but in quiet respect. He didn't sing, he never did, but his lips moved with the rhythm of the words. When the final note faded, the master of ceremonies stepped to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to introduce the headmaster of Clearwater Naval Academy, retired Admiral Carl A. Whitaker. Applause followed loud, respectful, the kind of applause that comes from legacy, not just rank. Whitaker stepped forward slowly, his back straight, medals lined in even rows across his dress uniform. At 73, his voice still carried the same force that had once steadied young recruits in open water. But now, as he gripped the edges of the podium, his tone began softly. 50 years ago today, he began. This institution opened its doors to an uncertain future. We had no fleet, no buildings, just an idea, and a few men who believed we could build something that mattered. He paused, letting the words land. This courtyard used to be gravel. The barracks weren't much more than converted stables. And our instructors, well, some of them didn't even have titles yet. Some laughter rippled through the crowd. Gently, Whitaker continued. But what we did have, what kept us going through those first long winters and endless drills, was a kind of stubborn loyalty. The kind you can't buy or train into someone. It has to be lived, and it has to be remembered. Then he stopped. Just stopped. For a long, uncertain moment, the courtyard held still. Whitaker's eyes began to scan the crowd, slowly, deliberately. He leaned slightly from the microphone and asked, voice low but audible, "Is Jonathan Reed here?" People looked around. Officers whispered. Several cadets glanced left and right. Whitaker turned back to the podium. He was supposed to be in the front row. More silence, until finally one hand, tentative, lifted from the back row. A young cadet pointed gently to his left, and there, sitting almost obscured by the canopy of the sound tent, was Jonathan, still seated, still quiet. Whitaker stepped away from the microphone, descended the stairs without a word, and walked across the gravel path. The air changed. Conversation stopped. Cameras tilted. Rows of officers shifted to allow him through. Cadets stood straighter as he passed. Whitaker reached the last row, and there he was, the same man who, 49 years earlier, had pulled his unconscious body out of a burning wreckage on a mountainside in the Philippines. The man who built the first marksmanship course with 2 shovels and a borrowed pickup. The man who'd written the first training syllabus on a legal pad with a broken pencil. Whitaker stopped in front of Jonathan. He removed his white gloves, tucking them neatly into his belt, and then without hesitation he raised his hand and gave the old Marine a full, formal military salute, a perfect 45 degrees, eyes forward, no wavering. The entire courtyard went silent. No one moved, no one breathed. Jonathan didn't return the salute. He simply stood up, eyes locked with Whitaker's, and extended his hand. The 2 men shook hands firmly, and Whitaker leaned in, whispered something only Jonathan could hear. Then, turning back to the crowd, Whitaker said clearly, "This man saved my life." Gasps. Audible now. And more than that, he built the foundation of this academy before any of us had a building to stand in. He turned back to Jonathan. "You've waited long enough." With that, Whitaker gestured toward the stage. A moment later, 2 officers moved to escort them both down the main aisle. Everyone stepped aside. Some stood at attention, others bowed their heads. A few cadets young, still forming ideas about what respect really means, felt their throats tighten. As Jonathan walked forward, side by side with the Admiral, time seemed to fold in on itself. Some saw an old man, but others began to see the boots that walked those fields before the roads were paved, the hands that held a hammer when there was no one else to swing it, the eyes that watched young men stumble and rise again and again until they became leaders. By the time they reached the stage, the entire courtyard had changed. No one sat, no one spoke. Whitaker turned to face the microphone, but then stopped. He looked at Jonathan, placed a hand on his shoulder, and gently nudged him forward. Jonathan hesitated, but then stepped up. No speech, no script. He looked out across the sea of polished hats and glinting medals, then down at the small brown bag still in his hand. From it, he pulled the torn marine pin, held it in the light for a moment, then placed it gently on the podium. He said only 6 words, "Legacy isn't what we take credit for." Then he stepped back. Whitaker nodded once, visibly moved. He returned to the mic. "If this academy stands for anything," he said, "it stands because men like Sergeant Reed built it without ever needing to be thanked." And then he turned back to Jonathan, this time with a grin. "But it's about damn time we did." Applause didn't erupt. It rose slow, reverent, like rain on still water. The kind of applause that doesn't celebrate fame, but finally recognizes sacrifice. For a long moment, no one moved. The final words still hung in the air, 6 quiet syllables delivered without grandeur, without flourish. "Legacy isn't what we take credit for." Then, slowly, a wave of motion passed through the crowd. First, one cadet stood, then another, then 3 more. Soon, the entire courtyard officers, students, veterans, officials rose silently to their feet, and then the applause came. It wasn't the thunderous kind meant for spectacle. It was deliberate, steady, each clap a wordless offering of gratitude, like a nation nodding its head all at once. Up front, Admiral Whitaker stood a step behind Jonathan, not beside him. It was a subtle shift, but a meaningful one, a kind of deference, as if to say this moment belongs to him, not me. In the second row, the young lieutenant who had earlier redirected Jonathan away from his rightful seat lowered his eyes. He didn't clap at first, just stared at the old man now standing under the bright midday sun, and quietly shook his head at himself. "A few seats over," another officer murmured. "That's the man I asked to move." Jonathan Reed, for his part, didn't look around. He didn't scan the crowd, didn't bask in the recognition. He simply stepped forward to the podium when Whitaker offered it again, adjusted the mic slightly, and spoke in a voice both gentle and steady. "I didn't come here to be called forward," he began. "I didn't come to give a speech, or wear a title, or relive anything." His eyes lifted slowly, locking with no one in particular, and yet everyone at once. "I came to remember 3 names. They're written right here on this piece of paper." He reached into his shirt pocket and unfolded a small, creased square. "I was 27 when I trained the first class at Clearwater. I wasn't a teacher. I wasn't even ready for civilian life. I just knew what war did to young men, and I didn't want that to be the only thing they ever knew." He paused, in voice catching for the first time. These 3 names, they were cadets in that first class. Smart, brave. They gave everything, before the world ever got a chance to know their faces. That's why I came back today. Not for the applause, not for a ceremony. He lowered the paper, folded it again with care, and tucked it back in. "I came because some things are only remembered if someone is willing to keep remembering." And that was it. No final flourish. No rallying cry. He stepped down and returned to the row where he had first been asked to leave. But this time, there was no confusion. Every officer who had once doubted him now rose instinctively to let him pass. One even held out a chair his own and didn't sit until Jonathan had. The ceremony continued. Of course, awards were given, speeches delivered. The brass band played its final patriotic refrain, but something in the air had shifted. From the highest-ranking general to the youngest cadet, every attendee now carried the awareness that legacy isn't only written in metal and stone. Sometimes it's written in silence, in footsteps taken without announcement, in years of service never documented in official archives, but etched quietly into the people and places left behind. Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the chairs were folded away, Jonathan stayed behind a few minutes longer. He walked the campus slowly, recognizing certain bricks, certain beams. Buildings had changed, trees had grown, but beneath it all, he still felt the same bones of the same foundation he had helped lay so many years before. He stopped at the base of the statue near the old training field. It wasn't large, maybe 5 feet tall, cast in bronze, but it wasn't the usual kind of tribute either. It didn't show him in uniform, didn't show him young or proud or decorated. Instead, it showed a weathered man, shoulders slightly stooped, sleeves rolled up, holding a worn field notebook in one hand, and standing just behind a group of cadets, mid-training, observing, supporting, not leading, just present. At the base of the statue, a single plaque read, "Not all heroes speak. Some just build." Jonathan said nothing. He simply touched the brim of his old cap and walked away, disappearing down the path that led toward the academy gates. 1 year later, Clearwater Academy unveiled its newest training facility, Reed Hall, a state-of-the-art tactical building complete with simulators, briefing rooms, and combat readiness environments, designed to prepare cadets not just for war, but for responsibility, resilience, and restraint. Jonathan was invited to the ribbon cutting, but he never came. When asked why, he wrote a letter. It read, "Buildings don't matter unless people inside them remember why they exist. I'd rather be remembered by how you train, not how you clap." That letter is now framed in the main hall of the building. Beneath it, cadets walk past every day, some pausing to read, others unaware entirely. But a few, the ones who listen closely, they understand. They straighten their backs, hold the door a little longer for the man behind them, write just a little neater in their field books. Because legacy isn't loud. Sometimes it walks quietly to the back of the room and still shapes everything. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.